Nostalgia. It's something that's been popping up in a lot of movies and TV shows over the past several years, especially with the recent releases of Spider-Man No Way Home and Matrix Resurrections. Now, you might think that this is going to be a video where I break down all the nostalgia of those two films, but I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm not talking about those films at all for the rest of the video. Instead, I want to talk about how nostalgia has helped to create a somewhat popular view on modern films that I think is not true. I want to talk about how nostalgia has convinced a group of people that 99% of modern films suck. Part 1. They don't make films like they used to. Pointing out that films are not made the way that they used to be made seems like a really bizarre thing to point out. Obviously, films are not made the way that they were made before. Filmmaking technology is constantly advancing, and our culture is constantly shifting. As a result of these two things, the films that are going to be made will always be different than the ones that came before. Of course, the films today don't feel like the films that were made in the 80s, but the films that were made in the 80s don't feel like the films that were made in the 50s, and so on and so on. This has always been a thing in the film industry. The only reason anybody would point this out is because of the nostalgia they feel for the films that they grew up with. To really illustrate this point, imagine if I said something like this about something other than movies. Like, wow, they don't make cars the way they used to. Yeah, no shit. Cars have a lot more advanced technology now, and they're built to be much safer. So the fact that cars are not made the way that they used to be made is actually a good thing. But I suspect that 90% of people who say that they don't make films the way they used to, it's not literally what they mean. Which brings me to the next part of this video. Part 2. Films used to be better. Oftentimes, people will point to the large amount of bad films that have been released in recent years as evidence that films used to be better. Like, hey, I don't remember there being this many bad films back in the day, and now there's all these bad films, so I guess films must have been better back in the day. The only problem is that there was a lot of bad films then, too. The only reason anybody thinks that there are more bad films these days is because nobody remembers all the bad films that came out in the past. To help illustrate the point that people tend to forget the bad films of the past, let me ask you, do you remember the film Hell Comes to Frogtown? Probably not. It's a really bad film that was released in 1988. 1988, the same year that Die Hard was released. And I'm sure you remember Die Hard. The reason why people say that films used to be better is because they remember films like Die Hard, and they don't remember films like Hell Comes to Frogtown. This causes some people to look at the past as a sea of never-ending good films, while ignoring all the trash that was also released. You see, the reason why there are so many bad films these days in comparison to good films is because there's always been more bad films than good films. To really drive this point home, and let's say if you're skeptical of what I'm saying, and let's say you really love 80s films, sit there and try to think of how many good 80s films you can come up with. Sit and think of as many as you can. You can even pause this video if you want and just write down a whole list. So how many did you think of? 10? 20? 50 films, maybe? Now compare that to the total number of films that were released throughout all of the 80s. I doubt you even got close to a fourth of the total number of films that were released. And that's my point. All of this brings me to what I think the real problem these people have with some films these days. Part 3. They ruined Star Wars, Star Trek, Jurassic Park, and Ghostbusters. Ah! You know, if this describes you, yeah, I'm really sorry for you. Part 4. The Good Films. To wrap up this video full of hot takes, I wanted to list a bunch of films that were released in 2021 that I think are good. If you haven't seen or heard of these movies, I highly suggest you check them out and see just how good modern films can be. Judas and the Black Messiah, In the Heights, Luca, Censor, No Sudden Move, The Green Knight, Pig, Stillwater, Free Guy, The Protege, Shang-Chi, Cop Shop, The Last Duel, Dune, Belfast, Ron's Gone Wrong, The French Dispatch, Last Night in Soho, Encanto, Nightmare Alley,